Hello, I'm Ben Miller, a policy analyst at Education Sector. I'm going to talk about a new set of cohort default rates, a statistic that gives important insights into the repayment experiences of recent college and university graduates. Each year, the federal government spends billions of dollars to provide grants and loans to college students. To ensure that these funds are not wasted, the federal government has developed an accountability metric known as the cohort default rate. Currently, the cohort default rate, also known as CDR, is calculated based on the number of borrowers who default on their student loans within 2 years of graduating or dropping out. Starting in 2012, however, the federal government will begin calculating this rate over a period of 3 years instead of 2. To help schools prepare for this change, last December, the federal government released a set of draft 3-year rates. While these numbers are designed to give colleges and universities a sense of what their new default rates would be in the future, they could also be a useful source of information for students and parents. There are 2 parts to a cohort default rate. The first is the borrower cohort. This is the group of students whose federal student loans enter repayment in the same federal fiscal year. For example, the 2007 cohort consists of all federal student loan borrowers who entered repayment between October 1, 2006 and September 30, 2007. The second part of this rate is the number of defaulters. These are the borrowers in a cohort who have missed enough payments that at least one of their federal loans defaulted within 2 federal fiscal years of entering repayment. For instance, defaulters in the 2007 rate are borrowers who entered repayment in the 2007 fiscal year and defaulted in the 2007 or 2008 fiscal years. The CDR is calculated as the percentage of defaulters in the borrower cohort. It's important because schools with high default rates can face serious penalties. If a school has 3 consecutive CDRs above 25% or 1 CDR above 40%, it could lose eligibility for federal student loans or Pell Grants. Losing aid could be a serious problem for most schools because so many students rely on this assistance to pay for their education. But recently, few schools have exceeded these thresholds. Only 2 institutions actually face penalties for high 2007 CDRs. Why is this? First, many schools actively manage their default rates by providing counseling or assistance for the first 2 years. Second, students take advantage of options like forbearance, which allows them to stop making payments without risking default. And third, it takes a long time to default. Even if a borrower never makes a single payment, it may take about 14 months to default. This means that borrowers who make only a few payments would likely still not show up in the 2-year default count. Since not many defaulters were revealed by the 2-year measure, and even fewer schools faced punishment under it, in 2008, Congress decided to extend the measurement time frame from 2 years to 3 years. Policymakers added this extra year of reporting because they believed it would yield a more accurate picture of student repayment experiences. To see how the 3-year rate would work in practice, let's consider the 2007 cohort. Under the new calculation, borrowers would be tracked through fiscal year 2009 instead of 2008. While this new calculation will not be used to penalize high default schools for a few more years, the revised metric can be useful for parents, students, and policymakers. So what do the new 3-year rates show? For starters, extending the measurement window to 3 years results in much higher default rates. For example, 6.7% of student loan borrowers nationwide defaulted on their loans within 2 years. But when the window is extended to 3 years, the number rises to 11.8%. This large increase represents an additional 162,000 students across the country who defaulted. But not all colleges had big increases in their 2007 CDRs when the measurement window was changed to 3 years. In fact, at 515 institutions, the cohort default rate went up by 1 percentage point or less. That's a tiny increase. But at 689 schools, the CDR increased by at least 10 percentage points. And 27 of those schools had a cohort default rate jump of at least 20 percentage points. Changing the measurement window affects all sectors. The 2007 cohort default rate at public institutions increases by 3.7 percentage points, while the rate for private not-for-profit schools grows by 2.7 percentage points. But the sector with the most significant increase is private for-profit institutions, whose cohort default rates grow by 10.2 percentage points. As it turns out, for-profits have a disproportionate share of defaulters. These colleges and universities enroll just 7% of higher education students nationally, yet 25% of all borrowers and 44% of those who default on their loans within 3 years come from the for-profit sector. The substantial increase in defaulters revealed by the 3-year window means that more schools would be at risk of sanctions when the federal government starts holding them accountable for the revised CDRs in a few years. So, in a concession to schools that were worried about losing their federal aid eligibility because of the change, Congress raised the punishment thresholds for the new rates. Under this revised standard, schools will have to have 3 consecutive CDRs over 30% in order to face penalties, as opposed to the previous 25% level. Congress did not, however, change the 1-year threshold of 40%. The result? Some schools would still be in trouble if the penalties were applied to institutions based on the 2007 cohort default data. Over 50 institutions would face penalties for exceeding these thresholds. But increasing the threshold means even more schools would avoid penalties altogether. Based on 2007 cohort data, 97 institutions had 3 consecutive CDRs above the old standard of 25%, but below the new threshold of 30%. And 11 additional schools would avoid penalties for similar reasons. Though Congress may not use the revised CDRs to sanction all high default schools, these data can help parents and students make better informed decisions. Parents and students can use CDR data to identify high default schools. These data can also help prospective students anticipate their long-term repayment outcomes based on the experience of previous borrowers at specific schools. Let's see how this information can be applied to a couple of actual schools. First, let's look at Clinton Junior College, a 2-year public school in Rock Hill, South Carolina. At Clinton, the 3-year graduation rate for students entering in the fall of 2005 was 30%. At the same time, 36.2% of student loan borrowers in the 2007 cohort defaulted on their loans within 3 years. In other words, the cohort default rate was higher than the graduation rate. And Clinton Junior College is not alone. My colleague, Aaron Dillon, who has written extensively on student loans, estimates that there are nearly 400 schools where students have a greater chance of defaulting on their loans than they do of earning a college degree. 3-year cohort default rate data can also help students get a more accurate picture of their repayment outcomes. Consider the International Career Development Center, a for-profit school located in Los Angeles, California. Under the 2-year measure, the school looks pretty good, with a default rate of just 0.8%. But extending that window by an additional year raises the institution's cohort default rate to an astronomical 38%. College is a major investment. Before students and families take on significant amounts of debt, they ought to have some assurance that they are entering a program that they will be able to pay off. Cohort default rates can play a big role in helping them make those decisions. To find 2- and 3-year cohort default rates for individual institutions, visit the U.S. Department of Education's Data Center. We've listed the URL here and on the Education Sector website. Making college more affordable is a cornerstone of Education Sector's work in higher education. Look for an upcoming Education Sector report containing in-depth analysis of schools that have done a good job of reducing their cohort default rates. To learn more about student loans, visit our website and blog at the URLs listed here, or you can email me directly.